Patreon.
気持ち悪い。
Wow. Listen to Mr. Mob Boss.
Before we start, I want to promise that I am going somewhere with this. Everything is Devilman. If you delve into non-shonen Japanese fiction that is drawn, you must be aware of this overarching principle. Berserk is Devilman, Evangelion is Devilman, and Attack on Titan is Devilman. Devilman is the quintessential depiction of nihilism in fiction. At the end of Devilman, the world ends when the literal Christian god has given up all hope for humanity. Akira, our main character, and everyone he ever cared about is dead, and Ryo, the antagonist, is killed by God, having realized that he killed the only person he ever cared about in Akira. No one gets a happy ending, and then God resets the planet. The only possible conclusion you could draw from an ending like this is that the author was trying to communicate just how fucked the world is, and is trying to say that living in such a world isn't worth it. Eren seems to have come to this same conclusion. And because of this very abstract and shocking conclusion, along with the fact that Devilman is just overall pretty great, Devilman became almost ubiquitous in Japanese media. The fact that it was written in 1972 during the foundational years of what anime and manga has developed into now, it's obviously had a huge affecting influence over many people. Evangelion and Berserk are the acclaimed pinnacles of their respective mediums. If you said Berserk was the greatest manga of all time, you wouldn't get too much backlash, and the same goes for Evangelion and anime. But these two series have more than just being the best in common. They are both very apparent in the inspiration they take from Devilman. Both of the masterminds behind these medium-defining titans, Hideaki Anno and Kentaro Miura, have read Devilman and understand the sort of personal depravity that makes someone create something as brutally nihilistic as Devilman. Berserk's depravity is not understated. If you've heard anything about Berserk, it's probably how dark it's supposed to be. And Hideaki Anno's battles with depression are literal legend by now. But if you somehow still doubt that Devilman actually influenced these two series, one of Berserk's core themes is about the devil inside Guts, and there are direct, big homages to Devilman throughout Berserk, through illustration in certain pages. And with Evangelion, the imagery surrounding the Evangelion ending and end of Evangelion, is literally taken directly from Devilman. These are two authors that understand the draw of Devilman and the nihilistic ending. But there's a clear difference between Devilman and Berserk and Evangelion. These two series separate into two distinct and different categories. Anno and Miura refuse to have their characters give in like Akira, Ryo, and God did. Guts did not give up on the world or humanity after the eclipse. He's overcome some of the trauma and is working through it, with new friends, and he even got her back. Evangelion has a happy ending, and the world doesn't end like in Devilman. These two series, clearly inspired by Devilman, have rejected the core message of Devilman and given the audience a form of honest hope. Both Anno and Miura seem to acknowledge the undertones and the depression of Devilman and include it in their work only to show how to overcome it. Shinji is given nearly the identical decision Eren and Ymir are given in this chapter, but he's stronger than them and he rejects it. Shinji decides not to give up and to try one more time. Guts overcomes and heals from the trauma of the eclipse incredibly slowly, but it happens, and eventually it will subside. He's dealt with extremely traumatic things before. He no longer dreams every night about Donovan. He overcame that, as he will overcome the trauma of the eclipse eventually. The extreme nihilism is there in both instances, but they overcome it. Berserk and Evangelion reject the nihilism and offer the honest hope that the audience can latch onto in their real lives. Series like One Piece and Dragon Ball may offer hope as a solution to these more nihilistic issues, but Berserk and Evangelion are more honest with their audiences and acknowledge with their characters how difficult these things are to overcome sometimes. And therefore, when Guts and Shinji get over these traumas, it feels more earned, and the message of this honest hope resonates more with the audience. It doesn't feel like pandering to a theme, the theme feels earned. And after all, storytelling is supposed to be about sharing a theme or a philosophy with your audience, and the Berserk and Evangelion method is a far more effective way of giving this same message. And so now we stand on a precipice with Attack on Titan. In my last Attack on Titan review, I made the claim that chapter 130 will be the last chapter of Attack on Titan. So we are very close to the ending, and so now Isayama has to decide whether or not he's writing Devilman, or if he's writing Berserk and Evangelion. Will Eren win in the end, and will we therefore get an ultra-nihilistic Devilman ending, with the rumbling flattening the entire world? Or will another character stand up and seize the opportunity to show Eren and the audience some of that honest hope? Now, the seemingly obvious answer to this question should be, of course Eren will lose, not many stories end like Devilman, and most things end like Berserk and Evangelion, where the good characters overcome the trauma and reinforce a positive message within the audience. But some of us that have been around for a while, like 5 or more years, know that originally Isayama was going to give us the exact Devilman ending. It's a pretty well-known thing. Everyone was going to die when Isayama originally put pen to paper. At the time Isayama revealed this in an interview, we assumed that that meant the mindless titans would have gone on to eat everyone, but we now know that things are much more complicated than that. The original ending where everyone died was probably Eren activating the rumbling and killing everyone. But Isayama has claimed since that as the series grew in popularity, he convinced himself that he had a responsibility to give his audience a happy ending. So now the question becomes, do we believe him? Will he make a change to his original vision and embrace a more Evangelion and Berserk way of doing things, or will he march forward with his Devilman everyone dies ending? As I said, we're standing on the precipice, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it all plays out, and which category we can put Attack on Titan in after it's all said and done. In any other series it would be obvious, the good guys would overcome the nihilism and defeat Eren and his rumbling plan, but with this added context, knowing that Isayama maybe originally planned for Eren to win in this situation, there's no guarantee that we get saved, which makes the ending unpredictable and makes me excited. If I were to guess though, it must happen. There's no way Eren wins in the end. And it's because of his most famous catchphrase. Shinji and Guts powered through the trauma, and I'd gone to say that Guts was more traumatized than Eren, and Shinji wasn't nearly as emotionally mature or emotionally stable as Eren. And eventually they both came to the conclusion that life is worth living and that a better world is worth fighting for. And why? Because they were born into this world. Eren's current philosophy, the way I understand it, is that the world is so terrible that he needs to destroy it because he was born into it and it's so disgusting. It's a weird form of self-hatred that seems to have permeated in Eren the same way it did in the first King of the Walls. He's given up and thinks that the only beneficial thing he can do for the world now is to end it. This self-hatred and the hatred for the world is not what I think Isayama intends to portray through the phrase, "because I was born into this world." The sentiment I think he's trying to get across through this phrase is, because I was born into this world, I must fix it and work to make it a more tolerable and better place. This is the Evangelion and Berserk perspective, and a far more positive message to reinforce in the audience. I don't think Isayama would engineer a phrase as cool as "because I was born into this world" to have it be a tome to the ending of the world. I think this phrase will be turned against Eren in the ultimate climax of our story. I've never had pause in my belief that Gabi would be the candidate from our cast to pick up the protagonist or hero mantra and either take out Eren or convince him otherwise. Well, until this chapter. After all, in a speech against Eren, she could use the phrase "because I was born in this world" as a counter-argument to Eren using the philosophy I presented above of "because I was born into this world, I must fix it." Since she was born into such a fucked up system, and yet seems to have come out the other end understanding and recognizing where she went wrong. After all, there were no devils on that island. But the most interesting aspect of this chapter to me was the heavily thematic and textual parallel it seems Isayama is trying to bridge between Ymir and Historia. Ancient Ymir, I mean. So now I think it might be possible that Historia takes up the mantle of protagonist and will either be the one to defeat Eren or the one to convince him otherwise, alongside Gabi. Now let's transition this point into a grander discussion about the parallels between Ymir and Historia that are made in this chapter. And then at the end of the video, with all the context I'm about to present to you, properly draw the dual savior conclusion with Gabi and Historia. Chapter 122 of Attack on Titan is notable from its title alone. To you, 2,000 years ago is the 10-year payoff to the title of Chapter 1 to you 2,000 years from now. 10 years and 121 chapters later, and the madman finally paid it off. But almost more notably, Chapter 122 is the Ymir Backstory chapter. Ostensibly, this is Ymir's chapter. In a chapter where the rumbling literally happens, Ymir stole the show. Isayama has shown us the origin of the conflict now. He's shown us where the Titan cycle began, and this is important because now, 2,000 years later, two brothers have radically different and distinct ideas of a solution to this problem. But as you know if you've read the chapter, Ymir has clearly chosen a side. And I'm so glad that Ymir finally got some characterization in this chapter and isn't just a personalityless plot device anymore. That's why this chapter succeeds as much as it does for me. Another choice in this chapter that I would like to praise, before we deep dive into this chapter chronologically, is that Ymir never speaks in this chapter. This feeds into the motif of ambiguity this chapter has going on. At the beginning of this chapter, we are shown someone getting their tongue ripped out, and this is an indicator of how the rest of the chapter will function. Now, it's purposely left ambiguous if Ymir's tongue has been cut out or not. She's never spoken, even including other chapters besides this one, but this makes her characterization stronger. The point is, she serves, and servants or slaves don't need to speak. And functionally in the narrative and in her personal life, she sought to make others happy through her selflessness. Even if her tongue was ripped out, she should have been able to regenerate it after becoming a Titan shifter, but she still doesn't speak even after gaining her Titan abilities, because that's the type of person she is. Whether or not she chose not to speak or was incapable of speaking is left ambiguous, and that's the beauty of this chapter overall. This chapter is not a tell-all backstory like Grisha's was. This flashback is very fragmentary. I don't think we'll ever get, nor do we need, a tell-all backstory for Ymir. We get the gist of everything we need to know from this chapter, and the ambiguity challenges the audience to fill in the blanks in the narrative, which is infinitely more fun. With those things established, let's chronologically go through the chapter. Now, in my piece-by-piece analysis, one of the main themes of the review will be me pointing out the Historia and Ymir parallels from this chapter. This will be used to make a larger point about the future of Historia's character at the end of the review. So the first page of this chapter makes the parallel between Ymir and Historia immediately. We get a reprise of a scene from the Uprising arc here where Frida tells young Historia to aspire to be like Ymir from the book, who was unnamed at the time. These stories had a massive effect on shaping Historia into the person she is today. The Crystallen's character Historia created was clearly her interpretation of the Ymir she read about in those books. The selflessness and the attempts to get everyone to love her that we saw Crystallen's display were all derived from the Ymir story that we see in this chapter. The description of Ymir here is also interesting. Frida states that Ymir is so inspirational because in this world of pain and suffering, she lived as somebody everyone loved. Now, Frida's interpretation of Ymir is wrong here. We know by reading the end of this chapter that Ymir herself, reflecting on these events now, doesn't love herself for acting the way she did, and she actually opts to give up her selflessness and take revenge on the world in retrospect. And the point of this flashback seems to be to contradict what Frida says and explain how she's wrong in this opening monologue. And this all builds into the moment at the end of the chapter where Ymir gives up on her old ways of selflessness and chooses to destroy the world. This flashback serves to remove this romanticized idea of Ymir from existence, the one that Frida talks about in that monologue. Ymir was actually not a goddess. There are no gods in this flashback. There is no devil of the earth that grants her the Titan powers. It turns out she just got it entirely by chance. This is not a destiny story or a story where history repeats itself inevitably. All this happened to an ordinary girl. She wasn't special, and it was foolish for the Eldian people and the audience to romanticize her as we have done. It's just like Carla said. She's just a normal human being, as Eren points out at the end of this chapter, not a mastermind 2,000 years in the making, and expecting that is expecting too much from a single human being. This is also important in her parallel to Historia. As we know, Historia is just a normal girl thrust into a tough situation. She did not want to be queen. She did not likely want to carry a child either, but I gather Eren may have given a similar speech to Historia that he gave to Ymir at the end of this chapter, right before they consummated their non-existent marriage. Eren told Historia that she was normal in the past and that he liked her because of it. But moving into the flashback, we see the then Eldian tribe conquering Ymir's village, brutalizing and enslaving the people there. This violence is something Ymir was exposed to at a very young age. It's also neat that we now know that Ymir did not found Eldia. It was already a conquering nation before she was brought into the picture, and there's definitely some irony in the fact that Ymir's home was originally conquered by the Eldian Empire. Moving forward, I don't think I entirely understand this panel. I think it's just supposed to present a juxtaposition where all this carnage is going on in the background while the incorrigible Eldians are having a wedding in the foreground. But I feel like I'm missing some purpose here. Throw a comment down below if you understand the purpose of this panel, if there is in fact any purpose outside of the juxtaposition I just went over. Then we transition into a scene where the Eldian warlord demands the person responsible for releasing the pigs come forward, threatening everyone if they don't reveal who the culprit was. And here we delve back into the Sea of Ambiguity. We don't know if Ymir let the pigs go free or everyone in a moment of panic accused a random little girl and she took the blame for it so everyone else didn't have to suffer. She either admits it or she takes the blame to be selfless and get everyone else off the hook. Thematically, if she keeps with the selflessness that her character supposedly embodies, then she probably didn't actually let out the pigs, but she confessed to it anyway to protect everyone else. This also draws loose parallels to Historia. This is similar to the scene where Historia agrees to be queen. She decides to do that because she was trying to embody the same selflessness that Ymir embodies in this situation, not because she wanted to be queen. Isayama is a big Game of Thrones fan, so I think that's evident in the next scene where some Eldian troops chase Ymir through a forest. This is quite reminiscent of the Game of Thrones scenes where Ramsay would chase women through the forest and hunt them for sport. But again, the ambiguity in this flashback seeps through in this scene. We don't know why she's being chased exactly. It's implied that it's part of her punishment for setting the pigs free, but it's also possible that this is in response to her running away, or maybe just some random act of cruelty by the Eldians. But again, the point being made through this ambiguity is that these specifics don't matter. The idiosyncratic details of these events 2,000 years ago have no bearing on our current plot. The point of this scene overall is to make us susceptible to Ymir's decision later on in this chapter, and for us to feel bad for her, not a history lesson. The Eldian warlord also mocks the idea of freedom in this panel. Him telling Ymir that she is free is juxtaposed by her running for her life in the woods being hunted. I'm still unsure if Attack on Titan is going to pussy out and have freedom be a good thing, but I think if somehow we go with the insanely interesting option of portraying freedom as a bad thing, this will be extremely thematically relevant in retrospect. So keep that in mind, maybe. Ymir is chased and eventually trips over a branch. We then continue the imagery motif of the scarlet blood on the plain white flowers that has been a part of this series since its inception, and then we see the tree. Ymir notices a gigantic tree and tries to take refuge inside it, but falls down the tree into a pool of water that was somehow concealed underneath its trunk, and falls into a giant skeletal structure that transforms her into the first Titan. This moment is what originally made me think about Devilman. This scene reminds me so much of the Devilman scene in Peru. At least I think it was in Peru. You know the one. I love the idea that by total chance, this otherworldly entity just latched itself onto a helpless girl, and that is the reason why Titans change all of human history. I love that this was all chance and that it wasn't some grand plan or some mythical event. Out of everything in this chapter though, this element seems to be getting the most criticism. But I think it's just continuing the ambiguity motif we have going on. Who knows where this spinal structure came from? It doesn't matter. How is this going to impact our current plot? You can draw a conclusion on your own, and that's way more fun. For instance, the tree I'm assuming was feeding off of this DNA spinal structure. That's why it looks so otherworldly and weird. It's gigantified. It's titanized. The Titan spinal fluid, as we are well aware, makes humans giant and gives them weird and terrifying proportions, and this spinal structure that the tree feeds off of has done the same thing to the tree. It's a Titan tree. The Titan genes are just something that naturally developed in nature by chance and evolution, and it latched onto Ymir in this moment because she happened to fall into it. That's what I think currently. Draw your own conclusions, challenge yourself, have fun. That's the point. You don't need Isayama to hold your hand and tell you everything that idiosyncratically happened throughout history to get us where we are. Show some initiative. So that's why I love this storytelling choice from an ambiguity standpoint, but from a foreshadowing standpoint, it's really clever too. To prove this point, let's rewatch the Season 3 ED. It's about Historia primarily, with some modern Ymir thrown into the mix, but if you already aren't buying into the Historia and ancient Ymir parallels yet, get ready. Not only does young Historia in this ED look exactly like Ymir does in this chapter, but in this ED, little Historia falls into water and sinks just like Ymir does in this chapter before being transformed. The two girls are connected in other ways aesthetically as well. They have both been shown to have been passive little girls with traumatizing backstories, but they have been shown to be framed similarly as well, like with the water buckets. They also just outright look the same. You could mistake one of them for the other without context, and I think that's exactly what happened in this Season 3 ED. At one point in this ED, Historia is swapped out for young Ymir, and we didn't even notice it, and we couldn't have noticed it until this chapter. And we can identify her through another used motif in this chapter, the blackened out eyes. The ED starts with Historia. It also harkens back to that flower and blood motif I talked about earlier at the very beginning of the OP. But from the 25th second moving forward, Historia's eyes are blacked out, like all the other characters are blacked out in this chapter, like Ymir's eyes are blacked out in this chapter. And that's why I think what we are watching right now is Ymir, not Historia. And this can further be corroborated because right after they swap Historia out for Ymir, we get the falling scene. Isayama pulled a fast one on us again. Everyone saw the foreshadowing coming from the Season 2 ED, but no one saw this one coming. If I was to play this portion of the ED for you, with you having just watched the most recent chapter, and if I didn't give you the context for the first 20 seconds of the song, you'd assume this was the Ymir scene from the most recent chapter. That's how indistinguishable young Historia and young Ymir are from each other. But then the foreshadowing continues in the ED, as this maybe Ymir, maybe Historia girl is shown running away from something like Ymir did in this chapter, when she was running away from the hounds. Not only that, but she's running over a bed of those plain white flowers, and there's a clear transition of blood coating the white flowers, which we also obviously saw in this chapter. And so now, even more than ever, the shot of the girl running into the distance as the music swells gives me chills. Now if we can get back to the chapter, we see the original Titan Ymir transforms into. Everyone is shocked, and she has those weird rib things that some Titan shifters have that I'm still confused by. Also, she seems to have no face, only a skeleton. But then the ambiguity strikes again. We then cut back to noticeably older Ymir, who is bewilderingly still taking orders from the Eldian warlord. He calls her a slave again, and she does nothing, even though she has the power to stand up for herself. He then praises her for her power and what she brings to the Eldian Empire. Now, as I mentioned, ambiguity strikes again. We have no idea why she would not just take this dude out and liberate the world right now. Thematically, it's neat because it shows that Titan shifters have almost always been slaves or controlled by non-Titan shifters, weirdly enough. And this works into Eren's fetish for freedom. But it's likely because she has no will of her own that she lets this go on. But again, we have no explanation to why she is acting the way she is, and it's so much more fun to speculate. The Eldian leader then mentions that she's cultivated land and built bridges across mountains and made Eldia grow considerably stronger. She seems to have no pride or fulfillment in any of this. But this also proves that that one scroll that Grisha inferred from was right, which makes an interesting point about what was and wasn't true about Ymir. We heard from Marley that the devil granted Ymir power and that she killed and destroyed everything. The illustrations we have of that devil have many similarities to the Eldian warlord here. So it seems that history has transformed this guy into a devil. I couldn't possibly know why that would be, and saw Ymir as a profiteer from his tyranny, which is somewhat metaphorically true, but not literally true. So the Eldian perspective was false. But the Eldian perspective was not necessarily true either, because it portrays Ymir as a goddess when in reality she was just a selfless girl who had no will of her own. She was fundamentally a slave. Isayama is saying here that both sides believe what they want to be true. Marley thinks she's a devil, and Eldia thinks she's a goddess. And neither one of them care about the truth, they just circulate a narrative that's beneficial for themselves. Isayama is commenting on this facet of human nature through this side point, and it's important that both sides are wrong. The Eldian warlord then says that he will reward her by letting her bear his children, which she seems to have again an ambiguous reaction to. And just like I said in my Jaeger master plan video, whenever sexuality is brought up or even implied in Attack on Titan quickly runs away, and we breeze right over the implications of that comment. We then learn that Fritz was not Ymir's bloodline originally in the next panel, when the warlord seems to demand in the name of Fritz that Ymir destroy the accursed Marleyans. I just thought it was interesting that Ymir non-consentingly married into the Fritz family, when I think most of us assumed that she was the original Fritz. Also, everyone has just about pointed this out by now, but from what I hear, the Eldians seem to be analogous to the Germanic tribes, and the Marleyans seem to be analogous to the Roman Empire, as they are iterated upon 2,000 years ago. In the battle, the Marleyans are destroyed since they seem to be completely unprepared for Ymir. Then we move into a very direct parallel shot of Ymir pregnant here. This shot here is nearly identical to the shot of pregnant Historia. We then see her post-giving birth, and she looks at the child ambiguously. Is she full of love for her child, and is her one sense of fulfillment in her life her family, or does she hate them because they remind her of their father? Who knows? We then get a compilation of her fighting and birthing more kids. Can she transform while pregnant? Wasn't the assumption that you couldn't without killing the child a major reason why Historia was safe from being used as a vessel for the Beast Titan? That's got some interesting implications. Ymir now has 3 kids whose names, as we'll come to learn, are Maria, Rose, and Sina. We then get a shot of her ambiguously looking at her husband clearly hanging out with his side girls. Does she care? Is she jealous? Is she mad that he seems to have no commitment to their family? Who knows? Ambiguity. Then we see what I assume to be the Malayan soldiers attempting to assassinate the now king. Ymir sees it coming and saves his life, sacrificing her own. They share some, you guessed it, ambiguous looks at each other as they realize what's happened, and he ambiguously delivers a speech telling her that the spear is not enough to kill her and that she needs to get back up and work. He then drops that this is the reason she was born into this world before calling her our slave Ymir for the last time. She then seemingly fades into the dimension she inhabited for the last 2,000 years, as we see an identical panel structure to the times Zeke visited her dimension. She seems to accept death and reflect on the drop of blood on the flower that led her to gain the Titan ability originally as she dies. Now this ambiguity is most interesting. The act of jumping in front of the spear establishes the selflessness I've been talking about through this entire review. It's probably the best evidence of it actually. Even this disgusting man she is willing to die for because her goal is to be loved, as Frida puts it, so she would sacrifice herself for anybody. But does she love her husband? The kids seem to be non-ambiguously depressed at the death of their mother, but the king's speech could also have been a loving one if interpreted a certain way. He's just too afraid to admit that he doesn't want her to die, so he phrases it the way he does. But if you read between the lines, it could be interpreted as him pleading with her to not die. But outside this, Titan shifters can regenerate, as we are well aware, so this shouldn't have killed her as the king said, but it did. But Falco pointed out once that a shifter has to have the will to live in order to regenerate, it's not an instinct. So Ymir chose to die in this instance maybe. Again, it's ambiguous. Is this finally the moment she gave up trying to be the girl everyone loved? Historia had this moment as well, I believe. That would serve as another parallel between them. And this scene could be a precursor to when she gives up later in the chapter and activates the Wall Titans. This is where she gave up on life, but the moment later in the chapter with Eren is where she gave up on the world. We then cut to the king forcing his daughters to eat their mother. As it happens, Ymir in the other dimension notices the coordinate power coming into being. She was the original and now her daughters are subjects of Ymir, and their bloodlines will birth every subject of Ymir we have ever met in our story, and the tree will alter accordingly. This is also the reason why not all Eldians can transform into Titans. Not every Eldian comes from Ymir's bloodline. The king then gives the order for them to continue this cannibalistic tradition with future generations as he dies to ensure that Eldir and the Titans will rule the world forever. We then cut back to present time and Eren has hold of Ymir. He seemingly just saw everything we saw for the first time. He asks her, having just relived her memories, to lend him her strength to end the world and activate the rumbling. He then gives the speech I talked about earlier where he says that she isn't a slave or a god but just a human being, which is again analogous to the one he gave Historia in the Uprising arc. He says that she's finally free to choose the outcome. He's appealing to her emotions here, whereas Zeke appeals to tradition and starts yelling at her to remain a slave and do as he tells her. Even if Zeke has the moral high ground here, which he clearly does, he's basically telling her to remain a slave to someone else's will, while Eren is dangling freedom and choice in front of her. It's also made abundantly clear here that Eren's intention is to destroy the world because it is so terrible. So I don't want any Eren apologists saying otherwise in the comments, or anyone trying to say that he has a moral argument. It's somewhat understandable why he would come to this conclusion. Hell, Ymir, the girl who's prided herself on being selfless and trying to be loved, is about to come to that same conclusion, but it's morally repugnant. Ymir then breaks down in a very similar way that Historia did when Eren stood up for her against Zeke's orders in the meeting with Kiyomi, and Ymir agrees. This is the most emotion and possibly the only emotion we'll ever see from Ymir, and it's near perfect. This moment proves to the audience definitively that she is a human being like Eren said, not a god. A god doesn't have emotions usually and doesn't break down in the comfort of a mortal like she's doing here. And this panel does a great job of instantly humanizing a character that had no human qualities until this very moment. She had no emotional reactions to any of the things happening in the flashback, and this feels like she's letting out all that emotion at once. It's the ultimate catharsis. You can see her actually fighting it in the first panel. Her fists are clenched. She doesn't want to give in to her emotions because then she can't be what she's always wanted to be, what Frida says she was. If she has emotions, she can't entirely be that selfless girl that everybody loves. But then she realizes that from her experience, Eren is right. She was the best possible person, and what did she ever get from it? The selflessness, the trying to be loved, what did it ever get her? Nothing but pain and misery and death. What I think happened here is that Ymir has given up on the world and the human race. She's giving up on trying to help them. She's given up trying to be loved, and she's given up trying to be selfless. What does she have to show for it? Nothing. So that's it. Burn it all to the ground. In 2,000 years, nothing has changed. The same war is going on, and the same atrocities are happening. In this moment, she embraces Eren's philosophy with a tear in her eye, and she actualizes the rumbling. I think Isayama deserves props for channeling all this build-up into this panel. This is the perfect example of a moral character falling to her breaking point and just saying fuck it. We then cut back to the current time and we get this great shot of Eren actualizing his Titan form, again in a similar way that Ymir did it the first time. Not only does this confirm that he isn't dead for anyone that was still on the fence, but it almost guarantees us a redesign for Eren's Titan. I'm sure he's gotten a power up now and a cool redesign to go along with it. He'll likely be fighting the entirety of the cast in these coming chapters, so he's going to need a power up. I don't think anyone will be on his side after this. Also, it's about time Eren's rather bland Titan got a new coat of paint. Then we get shots of everyone reacting to the rumbling, and then we end with this magnificent final shot of our final protagonist and our final antagonist staring each other down. What a chapter. Now this chapter is very dense, and I see some people complaining that maybe this chapter gave us too much information too soon. But if you watched my review of the previous chapter, I complained that the last few chapters were a little slow and uninteresting, especially when juxtaposed to the chapters right before it. So for me, this chapter was a welcome change of pace. And the fact that we are resuming the real story next chapter has me pumped. The excitement that I've talked about disappearing after chapter 120 in my previous video might very well be back. But let me get to the final point of all this Historia and Ymir parallel stuff. What's the point of this parallel? How is this going to get paid off in the end? Well, I think it has to do with another group of parallel characters that I just juxtaposed as protagonist and antagonist very recently, Gabi and Eren. Hopefully through this video I've explained why I think there's a parallel being very blatantly drawn between Historia and Ymir. And the Gabi and Eren parallel has been beaten to death, so it's self-evident at this point. But I think these two parallel couples are fundamentally intertwined. Gabi is the version of Eren that didn't give up, and Historia is the version of Ymir that didn't give up. Historia and Gabi are vessels of the Berserk and Evangelion thinking that we talked about earlier in the video, whereas Ymir and Eren have given up and resigned to the Devilman way of concluding things. One couple will offer us some of that honest hope, and the other wants the world to end for what it's done to them. That's how I see it. This also happens to be a perfect way to bring Historia back into the main story in these climactic times of our story. This entire arc, Historia has taken a back seat and hasn't done much. This would be the perfect way to make her relevant again before everything ends. She's a great character, and it's sad to see her waste away in the background. So ultimately my line of thinking has Gabi and Historia stopping Eren and Ymir from ending the world, probably with some physical help from Falco and Reiner in their Titan forms. That's how I think it'll all end, with Gabi doing all the practical work and Historia doing the convincing, and I think the final page of this chapter almost guarantees that the rest of the story will be a battle between Eren and Gabi, the purer version of his original personality. I think it'll all be a battle of these philosophies. But man, this panel is so cool. Our beloved protagonist staring up at our tyrannical antagonist, who seems nearly impossible to defeat at this point. It's David versus Goliath, human versus Titan, and who would have thought back in chapter 1 that Eren would be the Titan in that adversarial pairing? Fuck me. That about wraps it up for this chapter review. The chapter was amazing and Gabi will save the day, that's how I'd summarize this video. There are still some leftover questions, like how much of the wall has actually been rumbled? This is an interesting thematic way to have our characters that survive no longer live in a walled and caged society anymore, by having all the Titans break out of them. Our surviving heroes, if there are any of them, will be free of the walls at least. If you enjoy this video and want to see more like them, Patreon support and sharing the video would do wonders for me. With that being said, that's it. Support links in the description below. Thanks.
Last time I checked, you had no education either, you fucking whore.